You can access the entire episode now on our website, forbiddenknowledge.news, Rokfin, Rumble, and all podcast platforms. You don't get to be the expert unless you're part of that club. That's how you're allowed to be, quote unquote, the expert.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there is just so much to talk about here and so much helpful information. And so this one article turned out to be was a 10-part series at the Deep Share with Andy Rouse. And we just completed that about 3 weeks ago. And, I set out just to find out more about the origins of the expert and stumbled into the creation of our modern social contract. And so that was quite astonishing. And Louis Brandeis, this Supreme Court Justice, resident of the House of Truth, the sage advisor of all, was really primarily involved in all of it. Because he's, like I said earlier, a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, but he's also the most trusted advisor of Woodrow Wilson. 1914, Louis Brandeis is elected the chairman of the Executive Provisional Zionist government. So he controls Theodore Herzl's headquarters that were stationed in Berlin at the time, but because of the First World War, he had to move all of his Zionist headquarters out of Berlin, and they moved it to New York, and they elected Louis Brandeis, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, as the chairman of it. Okay, so Louis Brandeis, when we trace him back, he comes from Brandeis on the Elbe, which is a city just north of Prague in Czechoslovakia, in Bohemia, if you want to go back further, in Prussia. And as the story is told by his biographers, his family arrived here, his father Adolf, with a Rothschild agent riding shotgun. They had plans to open up the Midwest. Okay, so we're in sort of this manifest destiny era where we're still moving west and we're creating institutions. And along comes Brandeis, and it's actually multiple Brandeis factions. There's one in Omaha, but the one that we cover is the Louis Brandeis branch of the Brandeises. And so maybe it's probably here that I'm going to start sharing screen, and we'll just kind of go systematically through it because there's a lot of information here. And I invite everybody to go to bulletproofpub.com. Here's the landing site. This is what you're going to see when you land there.
Nice.
You see that, Chris?
We've got it up.
Awesome. Okay, so here's the 10-part series that we did on Brandeis, just completed. And it'll be the final work for me for this season. And we'll pick up again in the fall.
And I just want to let everyone listening on the audio podcast side to go check this out on Rumble. You can view it free there, or you can get a Rokfin premium account and view it there. So you have options to see the visuals here.
Yeah, great. So we'll start with part one. And so one of the most amazing things to me to find out was really the origins of this U.S. Supreme Court Justice, somebody that you would think would sort of be a poster boy for morals and ethics and, ruling cases by law rather than what he actually is. And he's a social science radical reformer. And he's born into Frankism. Now, if anybody's not familiar with Frankism, Jacob Frank, it's a degenerate antinomianism, or a rejection of all moral and social norms. So this is sort of where Sabbateanism comes from. And so a strange place for a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, really, is the first sort of stop you in the tracks moment that a U.S. Supreme Court Justice comes from such radically immoral places when you would expect somebody to have a good moral compass. Well, he was, that clock was really broken. And so you can see that Brandeis' family was from a long rabbinical line of social reformers. And his father was a revolutionary in the 1848 revolutions of Europe. So pivotal history here. And the Brandeises are involved. And so it says here, Brandeis' grandfather and great-grandfather in Prague had been leaders in the Frankist cult that swept Central Europe in the late 18th century. And so Jacob Frank, we've included a picture here. So this is a direct relative of Brandeis. Says that Jacob Frank slept with his followers and maybe even his daughter. He preached a nihilistic doctrine that saw this world as intrinsically corrupt and believed that the best way to imitate God was to cross every boundary, transgress every taboo, and mix the sacred with the profane. So that's Rabbi J. Michelson, PhD in Jewish thought, Hebrew University, JD, Yale Law School, saying those things. You can see the further credentials there. These are substantiated by multiple biographers and historians of Brandeis. And it says there underneath that Louis Brandeis had a portrait of Frank's daughter, Eva, on his desk at the Supreme Court, an heirloom he received from his Dembitz relatives, whose ancestors were followers of Frank. Brandeis eventually marrying Alice Goldmark, his second cousin, and daughter of prominent Austrian chemist, the discoverer of red phosphorus, Joseph Goldmark. So there's a couple avenues that need to be researched further, but we wanted to stay on point with Brandeis. So, Frankism, right?
Yeah.
U.S. Supreme Court Justice, you'd think that those things would be about as disparate as possible, but they conjoin. And he actually goes to Harvard Law School, and he's okayed by the Harvard Corporation to join even, earlier. He shows up there at the age of 16 or 17 and makes quick work of Harvard. I think he's done in 2 years, and he, in his SATs or whatever they were, he had the highest scores there at Harvard Law School for the next 80 years. So he had a reputation coming out of Harvard as a problem solver, as a sort of like a persuader, or he gathered people. He was a persuasive personality. Obviously had a background in Masters of Arts. He was able to really persuade. He's a lawyer, right? So he's definitely adept at those kinds of things.
As long as you're a in-the-box thinker and you have these great ideas that benefit the few at the top, then you're in. But the second you start thinking outside the box about what could benefit others, there's no way you'll become an expert.
Yeah. And so you see there, I think it is Ruth Bader Ginsburg that actually says that. I'd have to check the source, but it says Brandeis was the forerunner of all of other social activist lawyers who were later appointed to the court, such as Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It says source number 5. So I've got footnotes down here at the bottom backing everything up as best as we can. And that comes from the Brandeis Confirmation a century later from Oxford University Press, Paul Finkelman and Lance J. Sussman. Okay. So he's a social activist lawyer, social activist U.S. Supreme Court Justice. And so we are familiar with those kinds of activities, especially under Obama. But, this has been going on for the last 100 years. These Supreme Court justices that get political, these are crossing of boundaries that should never have happened. And normalized today, right? People wonder what the big deal is. So that's what our job is to do, is to inform people of why this is wrong.
Yeah, we've just become too accepting of tyranny. We've allowed so much of this to just continue. We're still voting these people in. We're still consuming their products. We're still participating in some of the most ridiculous agendas they're putting forward. So we are hugely to blame in a lot of this situation. Yeah, I would agree. And, when we cover part 10, we show the solution, and that is the education that they remove from our schooling. And go figure, it is critical thinking skills, right? It is our ability to chain reasons together, right? Premises together to form conclusions, and then to properly communicate with persuasive abilities to become a great orator. These are all the skills that they took away from us. And so you can see 100 years later that we've got largely, especially the television watchers, largely a population of people that can't even speak. They try to stand up for things, but